Good morning, Madison Hills. Feeling good? Is that hot? No? I'm roasting. Whew. Gosh, it is so hot. Okay, all right, so everybody's feeling good? I'm glad. So we've got 2 more weeks in this series. I'm excited about both of these last 2 sermons. They're both phenomenal. Next week, I think it's going to be just a great practical understanding of how we approach this. It's a really good question set up for us. So I'm hoping that you'll be here for that. It's going to be great. This morning, I hope you give me a little permission to geek out, okay? Now, this may be one of those things where you ask somebody in your family or your friend or a colleague a question, and you just need a really simple answer. And then they just go off because they love this stuff, okay? That's me. So when whoever wrote this question, when I'm flipping through these cards and I see this question pop up, I'm like, oh, yes, that's right. That's where it's at. That's where the magic is. I love that. So we're going to look at this question. I think it's going to be great. If nothing's going on right now with you, this is going to be great later on. This is one of those things where you take a few notes, write down a few things, then next week, next month, next year, you pull that out and you're like, okay, here's what I do. Is that fair? Are you ready for the question? All right, it's a good one. All right, here it is. How do I deal with conflict? Oh, I thought everybody was going to go, yeah! Like, come on. That's an exciting question. I don't know why I'm wired the way that I am, but it's really weird. This question got me juiced. I'm thinking, yes, that's where it's at. That's the bread and butter. I love this kind of stuff. So whoever put it, thank you. And I want to say you're my soulmate, but I don't want Michelle to hear that. But thank you so much for submitting that question. It's phenomenal, and I think we could do some really, really good work with it. But before we do, let me tell you, when I was 7th, 8th, 9th grade, we had an elementary school in this little town that I lived. I grew up in a small city called Loyal, which just is on the outside of Harlan County. So grew up in this little community called Loyal, and I went to Loyal Elementary School through 8th grade and all this. School closed and all that. Now they do like these inside yard sales and all that stuff in it. So outside of it, though, there was this huge concrete slab, but like big. It was like the city block size, well, Loyal City size. And it's concrete, and we called it the playground. There were no swings, no slides, anything like that, but we called it the playground. And we would go over there with wooden and aluminum bats. Where's Patrick Sawyer? He'll love this. We'd go over there with wooden and aluminum bats and tennis balls. And there is nothing like the sound and smell of opening up that can of fresh tennis balls. Just like, that's great. And we'd play baseball. And if we had enough people, we could really get into a great game. It was just a phenomenal experience. And we'd do home run derbies, and it just got really, really competitive. One particular day, we're going at it, and this guy comes in, and he's like, he hits this ball, and I think it's like bottom of the 9th, 2 outs, bases kind of loaded. We're up, his team's down. He hits this line drive, it just goes out, and then the people just start rounding the bases. He's coming around, and he's coming to home, okay? We're on a concrete slab. So the outfielder, why am I talking about this like it's an actual baseball game? So the outfielder slings it toward home, and the catcher's about to get it, and this dude, who was a really good friend of mine, he slides into home. We're built different back then. I mean, that's how we played. Backyard sports was where it's at, so just good stuff. So slides in the home, it was a phenomenal experience. But the thing I remember most, and I don't know why, but I remember every time we played, depending on how many guys were there, we would set some ground rules. And our ground rules would be like, okay, based on the number of people we have, this is how we're going to play. And sometimes the ground rules are, okay, based on who's here, are we going to play fast pitch or slow pitch? Or how many fouls? Like, can you foul out? Because I think is there a limit in the MLB? Can you foul out without it being catch? I don't know, yeah. So we'd be like, 4 fouls, you're out. Because we don't have enough people to kind of field it, so 4 fouls, you're out. And then ghost men. Have you ever heard that phrase? Not enough players, so I need a ghost man on first, and I come back to bat. So just fun stuff. So what I hope we can do with this question, how do I deal with conflict? I hope we can establish some ground rules that can help you now and later, and both individually and as a church. We'll establish some ground rules about really, and I love how whoever wrote that question, how it's worded. How do I deal with conflict? I mean, that's just a great basic question. And without some ground rules, it gets a little tricky. So what we're going to do is dip back into the Old Testament, way back when, to the early chapters of Genesis. Genesis has 50 chapters, so we're going to get into chapters 12 and 13, and we're going to look at a story of a guy named Abraham before he became Abraham. His name is actually Abram. So you may hear me once or twice during this sermon call Abram Abraham, or if I do, just ignore it. It's the same guy. Abraham, but before he was named Abraham, it was just Abram, okay? So this is a very sweet spot in Abram's life. When you're reading through Genesis, especially if you like to do one of these Bible study things, you just start reading through Genesis, and God is dealing with the globe. He creates humanity. He creates life as we know it. He's doing all these moves to make it the way he wants it so that it's good. And then he starts just dealing with humanity as a whole. So we see that Noah and his family come on the scene, and the whole world's just riddled with sin. So he deals with sin, the sin of humanity, large scale. And then those folks come along, they try to build that big tower all the way up to heaven. And God deals with that. He's dealing with humanity again. Then you turn the page and you come to Genesis chapter 12, and it's like a laser focus. God isn't really dealing with humanity anymore. He's dealing with a guy named Abram. And he's going to use Abram to eventually bless the world. And if you really like Bible study, then you can see this in like the genealogies of Matthew and Luke and a lot of the New Testament writings about how God started this promise with Abraham, and then it was fulfilled in Jesus. And through our faith in Jesus, we're blessed and we're recipients of this promise. And all the peoples of the earth can be blessed through this. That's why you read in Genesis 12 that God says to Abram, I'm going to make you into a great nation, and I'm going to bless you. That sounds good, doesn't it? You turn the page, and then Abram finds himself in this situation that I like to say, have you ever been in one of those situations where it's like, why is this happening? Why is this going on? So much good stuff was happening. Now this? So you turn the page right after God drops this beautiful vision into Abram's life. You turn the page to chapter 15, and now it's very volatile. Some stuff could explode. Some stuff could go down, and you really don't want that to happen. And Abram finds himself right in the middle of it. So you turn the page, Genesis 13, you read the first 6 or 7 verses, and we get this information that Lot, he also had. Abram was loaded. I mean, this guy had goats and cattle and tents and all that stuff that would just be clutter to us today. He had all this stuff, bringing it with him wherever he goes. Well, we read that Lot also had some stuff. And since Lot and Abram both had some stuff and they're traveling together, well, some quarreling. And this word is really fascinating to me, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But some quarreling broke out between Abram and Lot's herdsmen. So now what? Not only do you have the responsibility of trying to sort out this promise and move forward about how you are going to be the guy who brings the promise of God into the world and to the rest of humanity, and that's probably good news, but now you've got this little incident that's about to swell up. So if we establish some ground rules, I think Abram makes a few moves that are just phenomenal. And I think they're applicable or practical for every single one of us, no matter what's going on and no matter who is involved. These ground rules are applicable to any type of conflict that you can imagine. So the question, how do I deal with conflict? Well, rule number 1, make the first move. Anytime you're in conflict, no matter who it's with, make the first move. So when we're reading through the first few verses of Genesis 13, and we see that Abram's loaded, and so is Lot, and now it's getting a little tricky and complicated with them, and some quarreling is developing, Abram makes the first move, and the text tells us in verse 8 that Abram said to Lot, and I think the NIV puts it this way, and when I put this in a PowerPoint or in a paper, it usually underlines the word so. So I guess this is like a sentence fragment or something like that, but the NIV says, so Abram said to Lot. Based on all this stuff that's about to happen or this quarreling, Abram said to Lot. He takes the lead. He makes the very first move. Now, I don't know about you, but conflict is uncomfortable. And as much as I love it, nobody really wants to go through it. So that's what I wanted to establish this morning. That you and I, we don't want to avoid conflict, but we don't want to get caught up in conflict either. So I want us to reframe conflict so that we're not just going through it, we're actually growing through conflict. And when you make the first move, you open the door for something very, very healthy to happen. So a guy, Ken Sande, wrote a book called The Peacemaker, and he talks about responses to conflict, and he says there's this slippery slope on either side. He says there's escape responses, and in an escape response to conflict, well, I get to decide how I'm going to respond because the focus is on me. But then there's attack responses, and again, I get to decide how I will respond. But now the focus is upon you. And either one of those, Ken Sande says, it's a very slippery slope because either one of those, since I get to decide how I'm going to manage this, either one of those can send me into a realm that I don't want to walk around in. They can create or compound additional conflict. They can give us something that we're not signing up for. And he said, but there's also another option, and he calls these peacemaking responses, where it's God who decides on how you and I navigate this complicated process of conflict resolution, how we deal with conflict. It's God decides because the focus is upon me and you, both of us. So we want not to avoid conflict, but we want to avoid getting caught up in it. So that's why it's critical that you make the first move. Good so far? All right, not only do you make the first move, make that move count. Be very intentional with that move. Make the first move count. So the text tells us, not only did Abram say to Lot, Abram said to Lot, hey, let's not have any quarreling among us, because we're brothers. Now, that's what the NIV says, and I think it's interesting. No, they're not brothers. We're told in chapter 12 that Lot is actually the nephew of Abram. So I don't know how to read this, and I don't want to really miss the meaning, and I don't want to go down a road that wasn't paved for us or anything like that, but I do want to make this observation, that when you are involved in serving the same God, then there is something very special there. The relationship is reworked and redefined, if you will. So they may be by blood a nephew, uncle, but when you're serving the same God, there's a different kinship that is there. There's something different, and we do life differently because God is deciding what life in his kingdom looks like. So he says, we're brothers, and since we're brothers, that foundation right there says we shouldn't have any quarreling. And I love how he's making this first move count. He's saying, we're not even going to talk about this. We're not even going to have quarreling because that's the wrong conversation. If you flip to the New Testament, there's a great verse. And this is the NIV, and this isn't me, okay? This is the NIV wording this, so I hope you get a chuckle out of it. But it comes from 2 Timothy. And Paul's writing to a young guy coming up as a church leader named Timothy. And he tells Timothy about operating within a church. And then he drops this line. He says, hey, have nothing to do with foolish or stupid arguments. Isn't that crazy? Have nothing to do with foolish or stupid arguments. Why? Because they produce what could have been produced in the life of Abram and Lot. They produce quarrels. Now, typically I would say, okay, here's the Greek word for quarrel and here's what it means. But really when you do a deep dive into the study of the word quarrel, which when I read that, it just sounds dated to me. Does this sound dated to anybody else? The word quarrel, do you use that? Oh, they're quarreling again. I mean, I don't know. Do we say that? So it sounds dated to me, but when you do a deep dive study, it just means to fight. That's really all that it means. So instead of looking at the word quarrel, the word argument don't have anything to do with foolish and stupid arguments because they're the preface, the precursor. They are what prompts the fights. The foolish, stupid argument produces the fight. So the word argument, when you break it down, the word actually means a meaningless question. I've been in enough tiffs with Michelle to know that one of us usually gets off in left field and we start asking or addressing meaningless questions that just gets us off into this realm of quarreling. And it's irrelevant to the topic at hand. So you make the move count. So Abram comes and he says, hey, let's not even talk about that. That's not the real issue. Let's not even go there. It's going to create a dialogue that neither of us really want, and it's just simply going to distract from the bigger picture at hand. That's awesome leadership by Abram. So the text goes on. So you want to make the first move. You want to make that move count. And then you want to make that move helpful. So Abram doesn't get lost in left field. He doesn't say, let's not talk about that because this. He simply says, let's not talk about that. We're brothers. So, and he looks at Lot and he says, look at all this land. We both got a lot of stuff. And look at how much land is before us. And this is beautiful. He looks at Lot and he says, now Lot, you look at every bit of land available. And if you go to the right, then I'll go to the left. And if you go to the left, then I'll go to the right. You choose. That's awesome. That is fantastic. So in this moment of potential crisis, in this moment of potential conflict where the relationship could be eroded, Abram says, how do I deal with conflict? I make the first move. I make it count. But I need to make it helpful for the other people involved. Let me tell you something. That's a big boy move. That is a big boy move. Making it helpful for the other person. I saw this so plainly the other day based on this right here. This is some kind of can of soup that I'd never seen before in my life. Michelle comes home with a bag, and there's 4 or 5 of them, and she's so excited that this soup, that she discovered this soup, and apparently, I don't know the origin of it or whatever, but it was on clearance. So she buys this big bag of these things, and she comes home, and I kid you not, first thing she says is, hey, can I put these in your office on your desk so that the kids don't find them? Does anybody else hide food? Anybody else hide food in your house? So she's like, can I put these in there? I want to get to them first. And I'm like, okay, sure. So about 2 weeks go by, and I guess she just loses sight of them. So I sent her a text saying, hey, you still want these? I mean, they're not taking up too much space in the office, but I would like to relocate them. So she was like, I actually just put them in the cabinet. So I put them in the cabinet, and some time goes on. And then there's this thing that starts to emerge with Christian and Sophie. And I didn't realize that this is so valuable, but I find myself on the cusp of this conflict. They just both barrel downstairs, and Christian has it, and Sophie wants it. And I don't know who called it first, but they're starting to lay claim to it. Side note, anytime I tell a story about the family, I want you to know I get their permission. Okay, I get their permission, unless it's something really good about Michelle. Okay, I just got to go with it. Anyway, I ask their permission so they know I'm telling this story. So they're like, hey, what do you think? And I'm like, well, you know what? That's mommy's, so you need to call her and ask her. So they immediately both, as quick as they can, whip out their phone. And it's like, who can get to her first? You know, make out their case and everything. So they whip out their phones, they contact Michelle, and she does something so weak. She throws it back to me. Throws it back in my court. And I'm like, are you kidding me? This isn't fair. So they're like both pleading their case to me, and I'm listening. And I pull a typical dad move, which I thought was slick. I mean, I just thought it was slick. I was like, oh, and probably got a little arrogance about it. Anytime somebody approaches you with their head down and then they look up like this, it's not, they think they've got it. So I come over there and I'm like, this sounds to me like one of those, look not only to your own interests, but to the interest of other kind of scenarios. And then they look away from me back to each other and try to start bartering. Like, that's not even good advice. They didn't even want to hear that possibility. So can I get your take on something? I want to know if that was good advice after I read this to you. Because I think in a moment of conflict, when you want something and something's very valuable to you and someone else has it, understanding how giving that to them would be helpful, usually that's not the first thought. That's not immediately. We don't come default, programmed like that by default. We have to sort through that. And I think that's why Paul writes this in Philippians chapter 2. So let me read just a couple of verses to you and listen to the language here. It's a big like if, and it reminds me of Abraham. Hey, if you go this way, I'll go this way. And if you go this way, well then I'll go this way. Let's work this out together. So Paul writes these words to a local church, kind of like a local church like Madison Hills. And he says, if you have any encouragement from being united with this guy Jesus, if you have any comfort from his love, if you have any fellowship with the Spirit, if you have any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and purpose, doing nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility, consider the other person better than yourself. Verse 4, each of you should look not only to your own interests, but to the interests of others. That's Abraham or Abram, crushing it with this conflict stuff. Makes the first move, makes it count, and then makes it helpful. Saw this quote the other day and I was like, oh, that's the Holy Spirit working because it came at the right time. This guy was talking about conflict resolution. I really read this stuff. It's just fascinating to me. But anyway, he said, if there's a willingness to understand, or if you're going to have a willingness to understand the legitimacy of someone else's concern or interest, then that involves some capacity to empathize with the other person's sense of injustice. So I'm watching Christian and Sophie both, and they're talking about why they deserve this can. This can of tomato soup. I mean, is tomato soup even that good? Tomato soup. But it's so valuable to them. And it just floors me about how many times I've been in a similar situation. And I think the stakes are a little higher than tomato soup with crackers on the top. The stakes are a little higher, but it's the same thing. If we're going to make this work, I have to be able to empathize with the other's understanding of what they perceive as injustice. So if Lot's herdsmen and Abram's herdsmen, they're on the field. They're sorting through all this stuff that Abram and Lot have. They're feeling the brunt of it. They're corralling the cattle and they're moving the tents forward. They're dealing with it. So when they start talking about it, it's not just they're quarreling and fighting over nonsense. Well, they probably have some legitimate points. They probably have some inside information. It makes sense to them to talk about it this way. So what's the solution? Something has to give. So if being united to Jesus makes any sense to us, then the best way we can do that is make it helpful for the other person by looking not only to your own interests, but to the interests of the other individual or the other parties involved. So Abram makes the first move, makes it count, and then makes it helpful. Now, if you keep reading this story, it's really interesting. Chapter 13 ends. So Lot looks at the land and he was like, okay, I'm going this direction. So he takes all of his stuff and he moves this direction. And then God comes to Abram. And I don't know if it's serendipity or if it's sovereignty or what, but Lot makes a move and Abram goes this direction, which puts him in what you and I, if you've been around church for a while, what we will call the promised land. It puts him right there. So God comes to Abram in verse 17, he says, go and just walk around, walk the length and the width of this land and just look because it's yours. When I read that verse, I can't help but to kind of romanticize it and think, wow, he's entering the promised land. Maybe he doesn't know it yet, but he's literally walking around, and some of you will get this. He's standing literally on the promises right there in that moment, standing on and in the promise of God. So when God tells him, go and just look around, he's going and he's looking around at the freedom and the resolution of this conflict. It was sorted out the right way. And now he has a sense of peace and freedom about him. That's awesome. And that's what conflict resolution can do for you. When you set some ground rules and you're like, okay, this can get out of hand quick. Let me make the first move. I need to make it count, so I've got to focus on the right stuff. And then I need to make it helpful for the other people involved. Then a little time down the road, you can just be walking around without all that baggage because you're handling this not based on how you and I decide, not with a focus on me, not with a focus on you, but how God decides with a focus on me and you. So he's standing in the promises, and I think this is why so many New Testament authors pick up on this idea. And notice just these cascading verses. Just listen to some of this language, just rapid fire here. Galatians 3, Paul says, hey, if you've been united with Christ, then you're actually heirs to this promise. This idea that God will use Abram to bless the world, he'll turn him into a great nation and bless the world. You're part of that. You and I are the 21st century continuation of that promise. And if we're standing in that promise, then that's going to require us to set some ground rules when we experience conflict, just like Abram did, to carry this promise on, to navigate living in the kingdom, to model the way of what that looks like. We're completing that, if you will. So it's imperative that you and I make the first move, make it count, and make it helpful for other people. Maybe this is why Jesus spent so much time, and you go to John 17, and Jesus is just all about prayer, not teaching about it, but caught up in prayer. In this whole chapter, Jesus is praying, and he's talking to the Father. And he reaches the point to where he's talking about praying for us, the people who would hear the message of Jesus through people who go before us. And he prays, God, I pray that just like you and I are one, I pray that they're one. Everybody who hears this message, I pray that they're one. Or James, who was closely connected to Jesus, would write, the wisdom, how to work stuff out that comes from heaven, it's first of all pure because it's from God. So the wisdom from God is pure. It's what we need. And since it's pure, it loves peace. It is peace loving. And then the Apostle Paul would write to this church in Rome, and he would say, okay, conflict's going to happen, disagreements are going to happen, people are going to have different perspectives. So what you need to do is make every single effort to do what leads to peace and mutual edification. What leads to peace and mutual edification. The benefit of everybody involved. Those are the ground rules. So I hope that was helpful to whoever wrote that card. Whoever asked the question, if it wasn't, please reach out to me and we could keep talking about this. Or maybe it was really helpful and you like to geek out on this stuff as much as I do. We can have a really good conversation about that. But that's the goal. That's how you can deal with conflict in any given situation. Make the first move so that you don't get caught up in the conflict. Make it count so that you're focused on what is really the core issue. And then make it helpful for all the people involved, not just you. So Michelle has this thing, and we'll end here. It's some kind of detached screen, and she thought it'd be useful for me. You just hook it up to your laptop or your desktop or whatever, and it's another screen. I'm like, yeah, that's great. I can carry it around. That's phenomenal. I'd love to have it. She was like, okay, so here it is, and here are the 2 cords that come with it. I'm like, okay, I don't like a lot of cords, but all right, give me the 2 cords, and I'll see what it looks like. So I go to hook it up, and it will not work. So I plug it into my laptop, and it does that thing where, like, it brightens up really quick and then goes dark again. Bright and dark, like it's trying to come on, but it just can't do it. And I'm like, okay, that's a problem. So I call her and I'm like, hey, it doesn't work. And you know what she says to me? That's the first thing she says. I'll fix it when I come home. Okay, all right, okay. So she comes home and she gets the cord, she gets my laptop, and she's like, let's troubleshoot this. So she goes and gets Christian's laptop. She plugs it in, and guess what? The screen goes light, then off. My chest comes out, and I'm like, yes, that's right. That's right. I told you it doesn't work. So she switches cords, which I'd done earlier, then plugs it back up into Christian's laptop, and it comes on. And it starts working. And then she's like, well, this, that, and the other. And I'm like, yeah, let's not talk about that. And I want to throw it now. So anyway, I get my laptop back out and hook it up, and guess what? It doesn't work. Glows off, glows off, glows off. And then she says something so profound, and it sent me into this way of thinking about life for a few moments. You know, I bet I could have been on a magazine and be like, wow. Just thinking about that. She said something so profound. She was like, I bet this is indicative of a lot of other situations we find ourselves in, and we don't even realize it. Where you're involved in this situation, and you know you're right. And someone else is involved in the same situation, and they know they're right. And in that situation, both of us are right. That's amazing. And I bet that's true in some conflicts you are, have, or will face. You'll find yourself involved with some people who are right, and you're right. You're both right. Just like Abram and Lot's herdsmen. They're probably both right. And that's why it's critical that you make the first move and you make it count and you make it helpful. Is that good? Father, we are so thankful for you. All throughout the pages of your word, we see you making the first move. We see you making it count, and we see you making that move helpful. And we thank you for that. Sometimes it's through another character like Abram. Sometimes it's through Jesus. Sometimes it's through your Holy Spirit. Sometimes it's just through walking through the text. But we see you, Father, setting some ground rules about how we deal with conflict. And we're so thankful for that. For all the good you've brought into our lives, we embrace it now and we say thank you. And help us to turn that outward. And in our own little circle, whatever that may be, whoever may be involved, help us to establish those same ground rules and allow you to do your good work of making good things happen. To that end, we pray and we praise you in the name of Jesus. Amen.